In the skies over Europe, pilots were dying without being hit. No warning, no explosion, no enemy bullet. Just engines cutting out at the worst possible moment, when German fighters dove straight down and British Spitfires couldn't follow. The Luftwaffe knew it. British pilots felt it, and command pretended it wasn't happening, until one woman walked into a hangar with a piece of metal that cost less than a coin and changed the outcome of air combat forever. This is not a story of aces or dogfights. This is a dark war record about a flaw that killed silently, and the small, brutal fix that saved thousands who never knew her name. The problem didn't announce itself. It crept in slowly, disguised as bad luck. A Spitfire pilot would line up behind a Messerschmitt BF-109, ready to strike. The German fighter would suddenly pitch forward into a steep dive, straight down, violent, reckless. The British pilot followed, and then the engine died, not damaged, not shot, starved. For several terrifying seconds, the Spitfire became a falling object instead of a fighter plane. By the time the engine coughed back to life, the German aircraft was gone, or worse, circling back to kill. Pilots reported it again and again. Engine cuts under -G, loss of power in dives, sudden silence at full speed. The reports piled up. So did the graves. British command blamed pilot error, blamed aggressive maneuvering, blamed nerves. But the Luftwaffe didn't have the problem. The BF-109 used fuel injection. The Spitfire didn't, and the enemy knew exactly how to exploit that weakness. German pilots learned to dive vertically, knowing British fighters couldn't follow without losing power. It wasn't bravery, it was math. In the air, that flaw meant death. On the ground, no one wanted to admit it. Factories were overloaded. Engineers were stretched thin. Redesigning carburetors during wartime was considered impossible. So the solution didn't come from a boardroom. It came from a woman who spent her days being ignored. Beatrice Shilling worked with engines, not politics. She tested them until they failed. She trusted data more than rank. And she noticed what everyone else dismissed. The carburetor wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do, just not what the war demanded. Under -G, fuel flooded the system and starved the engine. The fix didn't require a new engine. It required control, restriction, limitation, a simple idea that nobody in command wanted to hear. She didn't ask permission. She machined a small metal washer, nothing elegant, nothing impressive. Just a precisely sized orifice that limited fuel flow enough to stop the engine from choking in a dive. It wasn't a perfect fix. It didn't turn Spitfires into miracles, but it stopped them from dying silently. She installed it herself, crawling into aircraft with grease-stained hands, fitting the washer into carburetors while pilots watched skeptically. They called it crude. They called it temporary. Some mocked it. Then the planes went up, and they came back. Pilots pushed their Spitfires into dives they would have avoided before. Engines held. Power stayed. The silence was gone. The German advantage began to disappear, not because of better tactics, but because the British aircraft could finally stay alive long enough to fight. No announcement was made, no medals were handed out, but in the sky, something shifted, and the enemy felt it. The change didn't arrive with orders. It arrived with whispers. Pilots talked in mess halls, in hangars, in the quiet moments before dawn sorties. Engines weren't cutting out anymore. Dives felt different, still violent, still dangerous, but no longer fatal by default. The washer spread aircraft to aircraft like a secret. Ground crews installed it without paperwork. Mechanics didn't ask questions. They had buried too many pilots already. German fighters noticed the difference first. The old trick stopped working. BF-109s dove hard, expecting the familiar pause, the moment when a Spitfire would fall away, engine dead, easy prey. But this time, the British fighters stayed with them. Close, too close. Dogfights no longer ended vertically. They twisted, spiraled, and dragged on until fuel and nerves ran thin. German pilots began losing aircraft in situations they had dominated months earlier. They didn't know why. All they knew was that British planes no longer disappeared when the sky turned upside down. The air war became personal again. Kills were no longer guaranteed by physics. They required skill, and that cost time Germany could not afford. Meanwhile, Beatrice Shilling kept working. She didn't celebrate. She didn't brief generals. She rode her motorcycle between airfields, inspecting engines, confirming tolerances, adjusting washer sizes by fractions of a millimeter. Too small, and the engine starved. Too large, and the problem returned. This wasn't innovation, it was balance. Pilots began trusting their machines again. That trust changed how they flew. Confidence returned, not recklessly, but sharply. They pushed harder, followed deeper, refused to break off. Losses slowed, then dropped, then stabilized. Somewhere between the Channel and occupied France, German intelligence took notice. Reports mentioned British fighters maintaining pursuit through -G. Engineers dismissed it. Fuel injection was still superior. The data didn't make sense, so they blamed pilots. On the British side, command finally acknowledged the fix, but only quietly. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't a permanent solution. It wasn't something they wanted remembered as the thing that saved them. It was too simple, too human. Yet squadrons that had been losing pilots weekly began rotating the same men back to the ground. Survivors trained new pilots instead of being replaced by them. The air war was still brutal, but it was no longer unfair. And in war, that difference is everything. The washer did not make the Spitfire perfect. It made it survivable. And in war, that distinction matters more than victory speeches. As pilots pushed harder, the limits surfaced quickly. Sustained -G still punished engines. Long dives strained fuel delivery. The fix bought seconds, not invincibility. Seconds were still enough to change outcomes. But the sky never stays static. German pilots adapted. They stopped diving straight down and began pulling into violent split maneuvers, forcing British fighters into extended chases. The Luftwaffe still held advantages in climb rate and acceleration, and they learned to exploit them with precision instead of certainty. Dogfights grew longer, deadlier, more chaotic. For every life saved by the washer, another was lost pushing past its limits. Engines overheated, pistons failed, planes came down smoking over fields and towns that never asked to be part of the war. Pressure mounted inside British command. The washer was working, but not enough. A permanent solution was needed, and it needed to be delivered while bombs were still falling on factories. Redesigning fuel systems mid-war meant delays, retraining, retooling. It meant grounding aircraft when none could be spared. The decision was postponed. Again, Beatrice Shilling knew what postponement cost. She saw it in maintenance logs, in cracked engine blocks, in pilots who came back shaking, not from fear, but from machines that almost betrayed them. She pushed harder, argued louder, documented everything. But wartime bureaucracy moves slower than gravity. While engineers debated injection systems, the washer kept doing its quiet work. Thousands of Spitfires flew with it installed, unofficially saving lives without ever appearing in victory reports. Pilots gave it a name. Not official, not respectful, but they trusted it anyway, because when German fighters dove, the engine no longer went silent. And silence, in the air, is death. The war in the air did not slow down to wait for better engineering. It accelerated. New pilots arrived faster than veterans could train them. Aircraft were rolled out with flaws that everyone knew about and no time to correct. Every sortie became a calculation. How much could be risked before the machine itself turned hostile? The washer became standard without ever becoming official. It appeared in aircraft records as, quote, field modification. No ceremony, no announcement, but its presence was felt everywhere. Spitfires that once broke off now stayed engaged. Pilots learned to push their aircraft into positions they had been trained to avoid. The sky filled with tighter, closer fights, less escape, more commitment. This changed behavior. German pilots could no longer rely on gravity as a weapon. Dives became traps instead of exits. The confidence that once came with superior fuel systems began to erode, replaced by hesitation. Hesitation kills. The death rate among inexperienced Luftwaffe pilots rose first. Veterans adjusted, but even they felt the shift. Engagements dragged longer. Ammunition ran dry. Fuel margins disappeared. British pilots survived long enough to learn. That was the real impact. A pilot who lives past his first 10 missions becomes dangerous. A pilot who survives 20 becomes lethal. The washer did not win dogfights. It kept pilots alive long enough to master them. Squadron leaders noticed patterns. Men who should have been dead were teaching formation tactics. Pilots who once limped back with dead engines were now landing intact. Replacement pilots weren't filling empty bunks as quickly. The skies over Europe darkened not just with smoke, but with experience. Behind the scenes, pressure finally cracked resistance at the top. New carburetor designs were approved. Fuel injection prototypes moved from drawing boards into test aircraft. But they arrived late, too late to matter for the men who had already been saved. By then, the washer had done its job. It bridged a gap no one wanted to admit existed, a flaw measured in millimeters, a fix measured in lives. And the woman who made it continued working in silence, her contribution spreading across the air war without ever needing her name. By the time anyone tried to measure its impact, it was already too late to separate cause from effect. Pilots who should have died in their first months were now flight leaders. Men who once avoided combat instincts were teaching others how to exploit the enemy's hesitation. The air war stopped being a numbers game and became a memory game. Who remembered what worked, who survived long enough to pass it on. This was never supposed to happen. The Luftwaffe had counted on attrition, on breaking experience faster than Britain could replace it. The flaw in the Spitfire had been part of that equation, whether acknowledged or not. When that flaw disappeared, even imperfectly, the math collapsed. German losses didn't spike overnight. They accumulated quietly. One aircraft here. One veteran there. Replacements arrived with less training, fewer hours, thinner margins for error. And British pilots noticed. They stopped flying like prey. They flew like hunters who knew the rules had changed. The washer did not make headlines. It didn't appear in newspapers or propaganda films. But every time a pilot pulled negative G without losing power, it rewrote the future by a few seconds. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became sorties. Sorties became survival. Historians later estimated that over 2,000 pilots lived long enough to complete missions they would not have survived before. That number never appeared in any official citation. It didn't need to. Its proof was written across the sky in contrails that kept coming back. Meanwhile, Beatrice Shilling watched the war continue from the ground. She saw new aircraft roll out with proper systems, with fixes that finally addressed what she had identified early on. She didn't smile. She knew what delay cost. She had already paid it in lives she would never meet. When victory finally came, it came with noise and celebration and lists of names. Hers was not on them, but the pilots remembered. Not her face. Not her title. Just the moment when their engine didn't die, and they lived long enough to fly again. As the war dragged toward its later years, air combat no longer looked the way it once had. Dogfights were sharper, shorter, less forgiving. Pilots no longer relied on single tricks to survive. The era of guaranteed escape through vertical dives was over. Every maneuver carried consequence now, and every mistake was paid for immediately. This change didn't come from a new aircraft model or a celebrated ace. It came from survival lasting just a little longer than it should have. British squadrons became classrooms in the sky. Veterans passed on instincts learned through near-death moments that would have been fatal months earlier. They taught restraint, timing, patience, lessons written in fuel gauges and engine sounds. German air doctrine struggled to keep pace. Experience could not be manufactured. Training hours shrank. Replacement pilots flew into battles they didn't fully understand, facing enemies who had already learned how not to die. The imbalance grew quietly, not dramatic, not sudden, relentless. The washer was still there, hidden inside aircraft that no longer made headlines. It wasn't mentioned in briefings. It didn't belong to anyone officially, but it was present every time a Spitfire stayed alive long enough to matter. Behind the scenes, the woman who created it watched the war end not with satisfaction, but with exhaustion. She returned to engineering work without ceremony. No interviews, no memoirs, no attempt to correct the record. She understood something history often forgets. War does not reward the people who prevent deaths. It rewards the people who describe them best. Her solution cost almost nothing, but it demanded seeing the problem clearly while others looked away. That clarity saved pilots who never knew her name, who never questioned why their engine didn't fail when it should have. And that was enough. After the war, history was cleaned, not rewritten, refined. Victory needed symbols. Heroes needed faces. Technology needed grand explanations. There was no place for a washer that cost less than a meal. In post-war reports, the Spitfire's early failures were softened. Technical flaws were described as limitations of the era. The transition to better fuel systems was framed as inevitable progress, not emergency correction. The gap was smoothed over. What had once been a lethal weakness was reduced to a footnote. Air combat doctrine moved on. Jets arrived. Carburetors disappeared. The problem that had haunted early fighters simply stopped existing. And with it went the memory of how close the air war had come to breaking on a detail no one wanted to confront. Beatrice Shilling's work survived only in engineering circles, quietly referenced, rarely explained. Her name appeared in technical histories, stripped of urgency, detached from the lives it affected. But the pilots remembered in fragments. A moment when a dive didn't kill the engine, a chase that didn't end in silence, a return flight that should never have happened. Those memories didn't fit into official timelines. They belonged to something messier. War as lived, not recorded. The washer itself became almost mythical. Some doubted it had mattered. Others exaggerated it into something it never was. The truth sat in between. Uncomfortable, precise, and difficult to dramatize, because it proved something dangerous. That wars can hinge on details too small to glorify, and that survival often depends on people who never fire a weapon. History prefers noise. This fix worked in silence. Long after the last Spitfire was grounded, the lesson refused to disappear. Engineers who survived the war carried it forward, not as a story, but as a warning. Aircraft design changed quietly. Fuel systems were treated with suspicion. Redundancy became doctrine. Assumptions were challenged harder than before, not because of a battle, because of a near failure no one wanted to admit. In training manuals written after the war, there was a shift in language. Less certainty, more contingencies. Phrases like "under all attitudes of flight" appeared where they hadn't before. Design reviews asked what happens when gravity turns against you. This wasn't progress driven by triumph. It was progress driven by embarrassment. The washer haunted design rooms as an unspoken example. If a 50-cent fix could save thousands, what else were they missing? What other failures were hiding behind confidence and rank? The air forces that learned this lesson adapted faster in the jet age. Those that didn't paid for it later, in crashes, in stalled programs, in pilots lost during peacetime tests that should have been routine. The woman at the center of it never sought to correct the record. She knew the truth didn't need defending. It had already proven itself in the only way that mattered, by keeping people alive long enough to matter. Some innovations announced themselves with explosions and headlines. Others arrive quietly, fit into place, and change the shape of the war without anyone noticing until it's too late to undo them. This was one of those. When the guns finally went silent, the silence did not feel like relief. It felt unfinished. Victory parades rolled through streets far from the hangars, where the real damage had been measured in broken engines and dead pilots. The war was declared over, but the questions it raised stayed unanswered. Why had it taken so long to listen? Why had something so small been dismissed while men kept dying? Those questions followed her into peacetime. She returned to laboratories and test benches where the stakes were lower, but the habits were the same. Assumptions still ruled. Authority still resisted inconvenient truths. The difference was that now, fewer people were dying when they were wrong. She carried the memory anyway, not as pride, as weight. Every report she wrote afterward was sharper, every test more aggressive. She pushed systems past comfort, past expectation, because she knew what happened when designers trusted theory over reality. Colleagues saw her as demanding, unforgiving, difficult. They never saw the pilots who lived in her mind, men whose names she never knew, whose survival depended on a decision made in a hangar while bombs fell somewhere else. She did not speak publicly about the washer. She didn't need to. It existed in the absence of funerals, in the empty seats that never appeared, in the pilots who grew old enough to forget why they had once been afraid to dive. That kind of impact leaves no monuments, only quiet proof. As years passed, the war hardened into history. Its edges were smoothed, its chaos organized. The washer became a curiosity at best, a trivia detail at worst. But those who understood engineering knew better. They recognized the truth most people avoid. That progress often comes from refusing to accept that death is normal. And sometimes, changing history costs less than anyone expects, but demands the courage to be ignored until it works. History prefers endings that feel decisive. A surrender signed, a city liberated, a war declared finished. But some endings never arrive cleanly. The washer did not end the war. It did not win a single dogfight on its own. It did not appear in headlines or victory speeches. It did something far more dangerous. It prevented deaths quietly. By the time the war closed its books, analysts estimated that more than 2,100 pilots survived long enough to complete missions they would not have lived through earlier. That number never appeared in official tallies. It sat in the space between cause and effect, impossible to prove to those who didn't want to see it. Those pilots trained others. Those others survived longer. Experience accumulated instead of disappearing into smoke. And the air war tilted, not dramatically, not instantly, but permanently. The woman behind it never asked for recognition. She never needed history to catch up to her. She understood something war rarely teaches its leaders, that the smallest failures kill just as surely as the largest battles, and that fixing them is rarely glorious. Her washer cost almost nothing, but it forced an entire system to admit that it had been wrong. That admission saved lives. When the last Spitfire was retired, when the last wartime engine was shot down, when the sky moved on to jets and missiles and new forms of killing, the lesson remained quiet, uncomfortable, and easy to forget. Wars are not only won by firepower. They are survived by people who notice what others dismiss. People willing to stand alone in a hangar and say, "This is what's killing us," and refuse to stop until it doesn't. This is why the story belongs in the dark records